Good morning. We have a tradition at Macalester College that goes by the name of the last lecture. A member of the faculty or staff is selected by the senior class to offer words of advice shortly before their day of graduation. You might, if you're willing to be generous, consider this my last sermon. Unlike our seniors, you did not select me, but Tim did, and I suppose his vote is in this instance the one that counts the most. These are not, to be sure, the circumstances under which I had expected to be delivering this last sermon. I had looked forward to plaid ties and scarves, to the beautiful sound of the Macalester choir, to one final echo of the bagpipes and drums in the sanctuary. I must be content instead with memories and a cell phone. So be it. My first day as president of Macalester College was Monday, August 4th, 2003. 9/11 was still a searing memory. Howard Dean was leading the Democratic field of presidential candidates. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had broken back through the 9,000-point barrier after plunging during the dot-com bust. The Minnesota Timberwolves were preparing for what would be the best season in their history, led by MVP Kevin Garnett. DVD rentals had just surpassed VHS tape rentals for the first time. The students now at Macalester were mostly in kindergarten or preschool. The average global temperature was about a half a degree cooler than in 2019. And if you were not an epidemiologist, you would have probably never heard the word coronavirus. What did not exist? The iPhone, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Uber. Barnes & Noble was the largest bookseller in the country, and Amazon was trying desperately to catch up. The computer on your desk was almost certainly less powerful than the phone that is at this moment in your pocket or your handbag. When did we lose Circuit City, The Limited, Oldsmobile, and Tower Records? When did we lose records? These changes are, of course, important. They have shaped our lives in more ways than we can count and more profoundly than we probably realize. A Rip Van Winkle who fell asleep in 2003 and awoke today would be stunned, and not simply by the epidemic that has upended our lives. What happened to consensus about the reality of climate change? What happened to the global triumph of liberal democracy? What happened to Thomas Friedman's flat world? What happened to truth? What happened to us? For nearly 17 years, I've viewed this question through the lens of a college president surrounded by 2,000 young people who carry with them the burdens and benefits of the current age. This is obviously a less than fully representative sample. The students who attend a highly selective private college are by almost any measure a privileged group. They do not tell us much about the millions of Americans who never get a chance even to imagine attending a college like Macalester. They tell us even less about the billions of people either living in or being lifted out of extreme poverty. But they tell us important things nonetheless about the state of our world at the start of the 2020s. Given the headlines that scream at us every day and the perilous condition of American democracy, it is easy to assume that everything has simply gotten worse. I actually do not believe that to be the case. An observation that will come as a surprise to those who are familiar with my allergy to optimism. Without doubt, there are ways in which the students of today are more troubled than those of 2003, and to be sure, they are facing an immense generational crisis. But they are also different in ways that give me hope. Maybe not next month, maybe not next year, but in the decades ahead, they're the ones who will draw from our current crucible the lessons that will make us a better people living in a better world. In 1947, W.H. Auden published a long, almost unreadable poem entitled The Age of Anxiety. He was, I think, 6 or 7 decades too early. For all of us, and especially those who are young, are truly living today in a staggeringly anxious age. We live in a world in which 80-year-old grandmothers from Mankato are made to walk through body scanners at airports and to discard their water bottles, in which college campuses are beginning to add active shooter drills to student orientation, in which the country with the most powerful military and the largest economy in the world imprisons women and children at the border, because many of our fellow citizens imagine that they pose an existential threat. The students who step onto college campuses in the fall, if in fact any do step onto campuses in the fall, will have spent almost their entire lives in an age of anxiety. They were a year old when the planes hit the towers and when fear began to be the defining feature of American life. Is it any wonder that they are more anxious than their peers from 1993 or 2003? 95% of college counseling centers report a rise in mental health disorders among students. And among these disorders, anxiety is the most common, followed closely by depression. These students are in fact different than the ones I encountered when I arrived at Macalester. They are more fragile, more fearful and worried, because for the entirety of their lives we have told them again and again to be afraid, and they have been listening. Now we're telling them to have courage, to be resilient in the face of a tangible threat. How well have we prepared them to be responsive to that message? How fully have we modeled the strength we now ask them to show? They are as well frustrated by the fact that those who are supposed to provide guidance have been telling them to be afraid of the wrong monsters. The chief thing about which we should in fact be afraid is not in our airport security lines or at our border checkpoints, and perhaps not even in our bloodstream, but in our atmosphere and our oceans, our burning jungles and melting glaciers. And this true threat, this genuine bogeyman, is the danger about which we are doing the least. Just imagine if our leaders took the change in our climate as seriously as they took the prospect of a shoe bomber on a jumbo jet. Just imagine. Young people watch in disbelief and sometimes despair as we deny what all the evidence tells us is true. They know that those most affected will not be the septuagenarians in Washington, D.C., but children in college and high school and grade school, and they are rightly angry and afraid. In 2003, climate change was barely an afterthought on college campuses. Today it is front of mind for the vast majority of students. This unflinching denial of science, of evidence, of truth itself is playing out now in our belated, inadequate, and absolutely inexcusable response to COVID-19 with deadly consequences. You can hide behind alternative facts for only so long before actual facts tap you on the shoulder and say, boo. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from this pandemic is that when scientists speak, we should listen. Front of mind, too, among today's students is the growing inequality of resources and opportunity that defines our 21st century Gilded Age. The top 1% in this country owns more wealth collectively than the entire middle class, or the middle 60%. This has only been true since 2010. The average rent of a 600 square foot apartment in Brooklyn is $3,000 a month, and in San Francisco it's closer to $4,000. Come to Minneapolis, we say, where you have to deal with a little winter, but you can actually afford to live. There is some truth to this, but we should not feel too superior. The demand for affordable housing in Minneapolis and St. Paul is growing at a rate far faster than the rate at which we are building it. Many researchers say that this young generation is the first in American history that can expect a lower standard of living than the generation that preceded it. As one recent study put it, they have come of age in a society divided into haves and have-nots. So if they are anxious, whom should we blame? Yet despite all of this, despite all the hazards, real and imagined, that we have placed in their way, if you spend one day among students on the Macalester campus, you will come away feeling not despair and not fear, but hope for our collective future. This generation of students cares more about racial justice than any I have known. It cares more about the freedom to love who you want, or marry who you want, or be who you want. It cares more about those children who will not have the opportunity to attend Macalester because of all the obstacles they face. Of course there are exceptions, but on the whole, this is a caring, empathetic, loving generation. In some ways, a miraculous generation given what they have witnessed from so many of their elders. When one of them hurts, it seems they all hurt, which makes them both vulnerable and beautiful. This is not a generation that is apathetic about politics or about civic life. More of them are volunteering. More of them are performing service. More of them are engaged in the voting process. Whether out of conviction or desperation is hard to say. The historian Jill Lepore wrote that nothing so sharpens one's appreciation for democracy as bearing witness to its demolition. The young today are bearing witness, and we can only hope for all our sakes that it is strengthening their resolve to save us from ourselves and preserve our fragile experiment in self-governance. It would be completely understandable if they gave up, if this were a generation of the skeptical and disengaged. It is not. And I truly believe that they will be the salvation of a world that seems bent on its own destruction. My time at Macalester is very nearly complete, and my opportunities to address you will soon be no more. So allow me to take this last opportunity to offer my own sort of blessing on my most sincere wishes for the future. May you always, when you make decisions large and small about your own behavior and about public policy, keep in mind those who are most vulnerable, the poor and the sick, the young and the hungry, the refugee, the mother seeking a better life for her children. For what is the value of a wealthy society if it does not include charity and mercy? May you reject fear and the fear-mongers and embrace hope and courage. Fear almost never leads to wisdom. The best choices seldom come without some risk. Be willing to take that risk to do the right thing. May you take care of our planet. We are changing its climate. Of that there is absolutely no doubt. And while the planet will almost certainly survive, we might not. And as almost always seems to be the case, the poorest among us will suffer first and most from our staggering indifference to climate change. May you remember always that character matters, including and especially in our leaders. No judicial appointment or tax cut is important enough to cause us to overlook meanness and avarice and prevarication. If we overlook these things, we hollow out the soul of America, and there will before long be a reckoning. May you remember that truth matters, and that those who throughout history have sought to bend or obscure or deny the truth have done incalculable damage. Nature in particular cares not a whit about human lies and distortions. It will follow its own rules, indifferent to our distractions. May you live lives of love and grace. This will bring happiness to others and to you. May you continue to celebrate your ties to Macalester College. It's a precious place, more necessary than ever before. May all of us persevere, because in the end, we have no choice. And may we emerge from this storm both chastened and more appreciative of the things that bind us together. The hugs and handshakes and pats on the wrist whose absence has reminded us of their power. Thank you. Thank you for your open arms during the past 17 years, and please be well.